This is your daily dose of all things royal. Welcome back, my gorgeous, good-looking friends. Today, we are sinking our teeth into something genuinely delicious. Charlotte Griffiths has just dropped a piece in the Mail on Sunday called The Truth About the Prince and Me. And it is the most spectacular takedown of this entitled, arrogant Prince Harry. This isn't gossip. This is a woman who was dragged into court by Harry, smeared by his team as some kind of honey trap predator, accused of perjury on the stand, and then forced to hand over every private message she ever exchanged with him. The result? Harry's entire courtroom story collapsed in front of the world. And the best part about all of this is that he did it to himself. Grab yourself a cozy beverage, get comfortable. Don't forget to hit that like button, and let's get into this. Let's go right back to December 2011. Charlotte Explains is a 27-year-old trainee gossip columnist at the Mail on Sunday. She gets invited to a shooting weekend on a 4,000-acre Hampshire estate. And who's sitting next to her at dinner? Prince Harry, fresh back from learning to fly helicopter gunships in California. So the story goes, Harry decides to test the new girl. He pulls a small white pill out of his pocket, pops it straight onto her tongue, and says with a smile, "Now I know I can trust you." She discreetly spat it into a napkin. It was probably just paracetamol. Probably. But that's how their friendship started, with Harry doing what Harry used to do best, being mischievous, boisterous, and completely lacking in royal filter. Over that weekend, Harry rearranged the solid silver African animals on the dining table into, let's call them, compromising positions. Different species, various acts. The man was basically directing a wildlife porn tableau while the butlers tried to keep a straight face. That was the Harry Charlotte met. Fun, reckless, a bit of a live wire. The same Harry who later accidentally shot a white marker pheasant and then acted like paying the fine was beneath him because royals don't handle cash. He told her stories from his recent Las Vegas trip, the one before the naked billiards photos came out. And this line actually aged like milk left in the sun, where Charlotte asked him what he thought of American Girls. Harry vigorously defended them. He said while they can be glossy, they're actually much more cerebral than people give them credit for. Cerebral. Yeah, I agree. American women are cerebral, depending on who you pick. I mean, Meghan Markle's not the best example here, but we'll come back to that one in a second. They gave Charlotte this nickname, CG String, and according to Charlotte, Harry loved it. She called him Mr. Mischief. He told her he felt lonely on Sunday nights when everyone else was coupled up eating Chinese takeaway. She said she felt a bit sorry for him because he seemed lost, but still fundamentally the cheeky younger brother everyone remembered. Charlotte continues on and writes, after coming back from shooting on Saturday, we enjoyed a second black tie dinner party before drinking late into the night. Most of us went to sleep just before dawn. By Saturday morning, everyone was feeling very delicate, so we lounged around feeling sorry for ourselves and looking for various missing items strewn about the house. Harry had just lost a brogue, and for some reason, I was convinced it was all my fault because I'd slipped on some random shoes the night before to nip outside for a cigarette. After lunch, we all retired to a cinema room, and as it was getting dark by then, we all watched a couple of films. One was an action movie that culminated in Islamic fundamentalists attempting to shoot up the White House, a scene that Harry was particularly affected by. "Allahu Akbar," he proclaimed loudly to the room, rolling his eyes.
Allahu Akbar!
To be fair, his remarks were doubtless influenced by the tour he bravely undertaken in Afghanistan, not to mention the army colleagues who'd lost their lives there. Back then, I didn't know what Allahu Akbar meant, but I remember feeling that the gesture was somehow off color. At some point, while we were all watching it, Harry shuffled over to my beanbag, got under the blanket I was sitting under, and put his arm around me. There was nothing particularly romantic about the sweet gesture. Although I wasn't physically attracted to him, I felt slightly uncomfortable. I was dating someone else at the time, and besides, he kissed another girl the night before, a girl who had turned up for the weekend on the arm of one of his friends. By breakfast, it all seemed to have become part of the previous night's entertainment, and everyone simply laughed it off. Then, as I drove my VW Golf home that evening, the Facebook Messenger app on my mobile phone pinged with a friend request from a certain Spike Wells. An accompanying message read, "It's H, in case you were confused by the name and picture, X." Firstly, you need to understand that the events I'm describing took place a very long time ago. The Harry I met in 2011 was very different from the embittered figure we know today, who moans incessantly about his family's privacy being invaded while making millions invading his family's privacy. Secondly, it needs to be stressed that I was regarded by our various mutual acquaintances as someone who could be relied upon to keep secrets. My day job was by then well known. Indeed, my first bylined article in the Mail on Sunday had been published in 2009. From then on, however, I had strictly observed one rule: never, ever break confidences. However juicy, they are shared with you by friends from your private life. His court case was based on the premise that a selection of published stories about him could only have been obtained by unlawful means. Under oath, the prince vehemently denied that anyone close to him would ever pass information to the press. None of them would ever be so silly as to socialize with a grubby journalist, he seemed to be saying. When the Mail's barrister pointed out to Harry that he'd once had a friendship with me, he responded dismissively, effectively branding me a sort of fantasist and liar. "I met her once at a weekend," he told the court. "And then the next day, after I'd left, after the weekend had finished, I found out who she was." He claimed to have then cut contact. The problem for Harry is that this is simply not true. We'd in fact met on more than one occasion, and I remained close to a few of his chums for many years. What's more, I had proof. Under a process called disclosure, in which it is mandatory for both sides in a legal action to release any relevant information to the court, I had to allow my social media accounts and mobile phone records going back years to be forensically examined by our lawyers. They unearthed, among other things, a series of private and somewhat embarrassing Facebook messages that Harry and I exchanged in the weeks after our 2011 weekend in Hampshire, and records of phone calls and text messages in June 2012, more of which later. These were then revealed as evidence in open court, all of which made headlines around the world, thanks largely to an exchange in which Harry and I had chatted about the naughtiness we'd enjoyed together. There was also a cringe-making paragraph in which cuddles were mentioned. While these references were entirely innocent, as I shall explain later, the publication of our correspondence triggered a tsunami of interest, turning me briefly into a global news story and sparking an avalanche of commentary on social media. Some of it was highly entertaining. Other bits were nasty and abusive. Friday night was party night, and after a long week working for the Mail on Sunday, I had on June 8, 2012, gone for drinks with friends. We ended up at the Hurlington Club in Fulham, where, sometime after midnight, I'd receive a message from the chum who had hosted that raucous shooting weekend 6 months earlier. I'm not revealing his identity in this article because to do so would betray his loyalty. Suffice to say that he was a good friend back then of Prince Harry, who has always remained impeccably loyal. On the night in question, he was organizing an impromptu gathering at his Chelsea home and wanted me to come. In the Facebook banter that Harry and I had exchanged following our meeting, the prince had given me his phone number, which was just as well because when I arrived at the house party shortly before 3 a.m. on June 9th, I needed to use it. My host had by then sent a second message instructing me to call H, who could let me in. Harry had his own set of keys to the huge Chelsea property and often stayed there, rather than at the palace, during time off from the army. He greeted me at the door with an enthusiastic hug and led me downstairs. In the basement, where there was a soundproof recording studio, I found 20-odd young people boozing, dancing, and generally misbehaving. Before throwing myself onto the dance floor, I had a brief chat with Harry, catching up on what we'd both been up to in the 6 months since we last spoken.
So, 6 months. What's new with you?
Oh, the usual. Keeping busy.
The party continued until dawn, when I bade farewell to the last men standing and took a taxi home to bed. Just after 10 a.m., when I woke, I sent the prince a text message. I must have changed phones dozens of times since then, so the messages are lost now, and I can't now remember what exactly we discussed. But trooping the color was imminent, and Harry had mentioned at the party that he was required to attend a related event early that morning. So I think I was asking whether he'd made it. I recall finding it hilarious that he was undertaking formal engagements following an almost entirely sleepless night. Little did I know that 14 years later, these small, harmless exchanges would be raked over in coverage of the court case. A boy in my friend circle went out with a girl who shared a student home in Leeds with a Zimbabwean law student named Chelsea Davy. Chelsea was, of course, the girlfriend of Prince Harry, who would often visit her in Leeds, popping up at some wild house parties or occasionally venturing out to the city's lively bars and nightclubs. Harry's privacy at such gatherings was always respected. There would be occasional gossip about his decadent behavior among the undergraduates, but the details rarely, if ever, found their way into the media. The university's student newspaper, on which I worked and eventually edited, would never have dreamt of betraying the couple's secrets. In the witness box, the prince continually claimed, "My social circles were not leaky." The problem was that this was demonstrably wrong. The court heard how my first boss, Katie Nickel, had over the years attended a number of events at which he and his various friends been present, from polo events organized by Cartier to show business parties at Bougie's, then a fashionable Kensington nightclub. From time to time, they'd not just spoken to the prince's chums, but also chatted with Harry personally. I believe to this day that Harry misunderstands how stories leak out. It's simple, really. One friend will tell a juicy morsel of gossip to 5 trusted friends. Then, they in turn will tell 5 more people, and before you know it, word has spread. Mostly it's harmless. Some people, many in fact, leak on purpose. Because I understand this process, I tend in my personal life to be more cautious than most when I hear something confidential. People naturally assume the journalists in the room will be the leak, so it can have the opposite effect. To illustrate this point, my witness statement for the trial told how our mutual friend had actually invited me to a second shooting weekend the following year. Harry was unable to attend this one due to army commitments, but his new girlfriend, an aspiring actress named Cressida Bonus, had been invited. So were Prince William and his wife, Catherine, whom he'd married the previous year. When we sat down to dinner on the Friday night of that house party in December 2012, it emerged that William had come alone. He explained that Catherine was suffering from severe morning sickness. The fact she was pregnant with their first child was, at the time, unknown and would have been a major front-page news story. But like everyone else at the gathering, I kept the information to myself, allowing the palace to make a formal announcement 3 days later. The weekend was memorable for a second reason. Catherine's absence meant Cressida was required to sit next to William at lunch. Inevitably, she felt that she was being assessed as a potential addition to the firm, so found the experience extremely awkward. Not least because, despite being Prince Harry's semi official consort, she, at the time, remained very much in love with her then ex boyfriend Harry, Wentworth Stanley. In the months and years to come, I would become quite friendly with Cressida, who is a fun and generous woman. Pressure from Prince Harry's friends, who were understandably keen for him to find a happily ever after, meant she kept their relationship going for longer than it might have. But she eventually extricated herself from the whole thing and in 2020 married Wentworth Stanley. By then, my career had taken off. In fact, I was delighted to break the news of the couple's engagement with their consent to readers of my weekly mail on Sunday column. So now here is the juicy part. She writes, the dreadful barrister David Sherborne, claiming I was some sort of fantasist who had been deliberately overplaying my friendship with Harry. This, he repeatedly implied, was to conceal the fact that I had been using illegal practices to obtain stories. Furthermore, he said, I had completely invented the anecdote in my witness statement about Prince William and his wife's morning sickness. If the latter was true, it would follow that I was guilty of perjury, for which the maximum sentence is 7 years imprisonment. To be falsely accused of such a serious crime in a very public arena was deeply upsetting, and I remained appalled to this day that the prince chose to participate in this grotesque charade. In fact, I neither embellished nor downplayed what had happened. My job was simply to set out the facts as required by both his lawyers and mine. What is even more galling, given Sherborne's line of attack, is that in the months leading up to my court appearance, Harry's circle had been very leaky indeed. I can now reveal that during the summer of 2025, a close advisor to Harry and Meghan had contacted me out of the blue and invited me to lunch at the Ivy restaurant in London. As a result of information given to me at that lunch meeting, I placed a series of stories in the Mail on Sunday that portrayed the couple in a positive light. This included a front-page article which ran in July suggesting that Harry and Meghan were attempting to rebuild their relationship with King Charles. It revolved around the fact that Liam Maguire and Meredith Maines, Harry and Meghan's U.S. PR chiefs, were to hold clear-the-air talks with the monarch's aide, Tobin Andre, in London. I was duly tipped off about the meeting, which was held at the Royal Overseas League near Clarence House. The attendees settled themselves on a balcony plainly visible from the public park below. The Mail on Sunday arranged for a photographer to capture the cozy but very embarrassing scene. In a development which speaks volumes for their integrity, sources close to the Sussexes then briefed the Daily Telegraph that they were very frustrated that the pictures of the Royal Overseas League gathering had ended up in the Mail on Sunday, suggesting, quite falsely, that the palace was responsible for a grotesque betrayal of trust. Now, just 6 months later, the prince was impugning my integrity while swearing that his people never leaked and that stories that ended up in my newspaper must have been obtained illegally. In court, the prince had said under oath that he had met me just once. He added that he then cut me off when he'd learned of what I did for a living. Harry's Facebook messages, sent from an account he'd maintained under the username Spike Wells, indicated otherwise. We'd actually corresponded from December 4th until January 22, 2012, and it was me, rather than Harry, who brought up our Facebook conversation to an end. I'd failed to respond to a message in which he suggested he'd be coming to London the next month. In quotes, I've been seriously busy since I last saw you, but plan on getting back in the mix for Feb. You best be around. Or to use social media parlance describing someone who fails to respond to a message, it was me who had ghosted the prince. But all these revelations came at a cost. Publication of the messages turned me into a global internet news story. Today, I'm a happily married 42-year-old mother of 3 with a wonderful husband. My years of partying until dawn are long gone, and I have no particular desire to relive them. But suddenly, those messages in which I'd spoken about the fun weekend of naughtiness and Harry had recalled our movie snuggles were interpreted as evidence of some sort of romantic liaison. In fact, we'd merely shared a blanket during a film screening in a sitting room with other people present on a Sunday afternoon. The naughtiness referred to excessive alcohol consumption. A reference by Harry to a Cinderella's shoe in a separate message inspired further misleading headlines suggesting we had been intimate. In fact, the shoe was one of those brogues which had disappeared after I borrowed them in order to head outside for a cigarette. The truth was, in other words, rather less exciting than headlines suggested. As a journalist, I should stress that I have absolutely no problem with being written about. People who hold others to account for a living shouldn't complain when they are scrutinized. That said, I was saddened, if not entirely surprised, that in the sewers of social media, where women are routinely abused and objectified, I was bombarded with tens of thousands of messages dubbing me a harlot and a slut and worse. At one point, Lady Colin Campbell, the sensationalist royal commentator, saw fit to call me a drunkard. The hatred and bile was sickening. And the prince? The truth is, I rather like what I briefly knew of the old Harry. He could be mischievous, irreverent, and occasionally exasperating, but he was also funny company. The man he has become is someone I barely recognize and someone for whom I have lost all respect. After all, it was Harry's PR machine which during the court case attempted to paint him as the victim of a predatory siren. At one point, Maguire provided hostile reporters with a deeply misogynistic briefing that I had deliberately went to the house party to seduce Prince Harry in a honey trap operation. Such claims were all nonsense. What sort of honey trap stays silent for 15 years? As are suggestions that Harry and I were ever intimately involved. In truth, I would have taken details of our relationship to my grave, had I not been dragged to court to be casually smeared by a royal whose arrogance and sense of entitlement has now rotted whatever moral compass he once possessed. This is the same Harry who stands on stages pontificating about the evils of social media while fronting gooey campaigns about online bullying. The hypocrisy is breathtaking. Before he dragged me into court, I'd almost forgotten about our brief friendship. Now, I rather wish I could erase it altogether. So here are my thoughts on this. Okay, so Prince Harry, he lied in court. And what's going to happen to him? Likely nothing. Charlotte Griffiths gets her story out there, and sure, we can take her side and, feel like, yeah, she's getting back at Prince Harry, but let's not forget, she's a part of this propaganda game. Now, I'm not sure what kind of abuse she was receiving online, but yeah, people were making fun of her because of the way that it was written in the media, and I can understand how that would feel embarrassing. Now, remember, she is a royal reporter. It's very different to your regular independent journalist who does investigative work. She is pretty much an extension of the PR teams for the royal family to push out the preferred narratives. I mean, you can see it in this article itself. She said, for a while, she was putting out these positive stories about Harry and Meghan as a favor for getting this little inside scoop. When you look at these people and what they do, their job is to pull on the heartstrings, to sell the public on preferred narrative. And in this case, this article was her narrative to clear the air because she was globally humiliated. And I don't blame her. I don't blame her one bit. But at the same time, are part of this system that has been manipulating the public. So I can't feel that sorry for her. I really can't. But on the flip side, she's kind of giving away the game. But the question is, do we trust what she's telling us? And unfortunately, I can't get there. Charlotte mentions this one detail that had me thinking. Who exactly did Charlotte go and have lunch at the Ivy with that is a close advisor to Harry and Meghan? The only person that I could think of is James Holt, because James Holt was back in the UK in the summertime. It could be him, but honestly, do you see James Holt taking people out to lunch at the Ivy in London? Seems rather posh for that kind of guy. But what has me stuck here is this phrase, out of the blue. Now, I know in the past, James Holt had to deal with the media fairly frequently when Harry and Meghan were still working royals. Not so sure how often he was working with the media when they moved to California, but I suspect that he had been involved in some way, in some form. So, hearing this phrase out of the blue makes me feel like this is a contact that hadn't regularly been involved with Charlotte. And given that Charlotte had been reporting on this couple the last 10 years, I find it a little bit weird that it would be James. The other person that I'm thinking of, could it be one of my favorite people here, Tobin Andre? The one that struck this channel on Christmas Day, telling me that I ruined Christmas Day for people in the UK because I broadcasted the King's speech before it was aired in Britain. Now, how is that my problem when it was all over social media because Australia had broadcasted it first? Now, I thought, as a Christian, in supporting this brand new king, that sharing his first Christmas message would have been seen as something positive. Like, how was I supposed to know that this Christmas message is broadcasted on Christmas at 3 p.m.? I wouldn't have known that, especially when the broadcast was all over social media. It was an honest mistake, but it was coming from a good place. And the thing that sticks in my craw about what Tobin did to me was that I asked for some grace on Christmas. But I asked for grace in that retraction because not only was it an honest mistake, but when a creator gets a strike, you can't post for 7 days, which means if you're doing this for a living and have to keep a roof over your head and food on your table, you're not able to earn for that week. The fact that this guy didn't care and did it on Christmas Day, not only to ruin my Christmas, but also to affect me financially, just goes to show you the kind of people Charles has surrounding him. So I don't think we should rule out that it wasn't Tobin himself that went to lunch with Charlotte Griffiths at the Ivy. Remember, this guy was also an editor at the Daily Mail. So, wouldn't that be more appropriate to say that out of the blue, former editor of the Daily Mail called Charlotte Griffiths to go sit down and have lunch? Yeah, that's a possibility. What I notice is throughout this piece, Charlotte is very selective with the names that she chose to drop. If the purpose of this piece was to get back at Harry for dragging her into this court case and exposing all of this and humiliating her on a global stage, why wouldn't she be transparent about who from the Sussex team she went to lunch with? She had no problem dropping Liam Maguire's name. Do you see what I mean here? It'd be very different if the past 10 years wasn't this giant manipulation, but it has been. And all of these people have lied to us. So why should we all of a sudden now take Charlotte at her word? Especially when she can't even be transparent as to who the person was she went and had lunch with from the Sussex camp. Sure, this is all very entertaining because we definitely want to see Harry and Meghan's comeuppance, but we have to ask, what was Charlotte's purpose in putting this out there? Is this going to change Harry and Meghan's behavior? No. Is Harry going to give an apology? No. Has there been any sort of clapback from the Sussex PR team? No. So ask yourself this question, why not? Why is it that Harry and Meghan clap back at certain things, but then remain silent on others? Like in this situation. Just some things to keep in the back of your head. I think it'll be interesting in a couple of months when this all dies down to see if Charlotte Griffiths starts writing stories again about Harry and Meghan. I don't have an answer here for you. All I can say is I wouldn't take this at face value. Anyhow, what do you guys think? What did you think of this piece? Let me know your thoughts below. As always, I will be back with more content, but until then, please be safe and I'll talk to you later. Bye!
Such a fraud.